President Biden signing into law today the Honoring Our PACT Act, a significant expansion of benefits and services for toxic burn pit exposed U.S. veterans. The president just gave some remarks. Now he's getting ready to formally sign that bill into law. Now, this is a bill that garnered wide bipartisan support. It will expand VA benefits eligibility to more than 3.5 million veterans. ABC News' Jay O'Brien and ABC News senior Pentagon reporter Louis Martinez are joining me now with more on this. Louis, what changes can veterans expect now that this law is passed, both short-term and long-term?
Diane, in the short term, you will be able to apply for these benefits. No longer will the burden of proof be upon you to prove that you suffered exposure and you suffered illnesses as a result of that exposure. The presumption will be there for up to 23 illnesses. You heard the president talk about respiratory illnesses, some types of cancer. The VA will accept your claim now and will process those claims, and you will be eligible for benefits. Benefits not only to the individual, but also to survivors and families. You heard the president talk about a $2,000 monthly stipend that will be provided to them, access to additional loans, access to scholarships. It's all there in this new bill. It's all information that has been developing over the last 20 years or so. The exposure to burn pits, that service members in Iraq and Afghanistan had suffered these unexplained illnesses as a result of what they believed may have been burn pits, but it took a long time for the Veterans Administration to accept that because, again, the burden of proof had been on the individual. That's no longer the case. So you're going to see that in the short term. There's going to be a one-year eligibility enrollment program for service members who did not fight in Iraq and Afghanistan because this pact, this promise to address comprehensive toxins, is not only for service members from Iraq and Afghanistan, but it also stretches back to the Vietnam War. You heard the president talk about what he had done when he was a senator to put through legislation to address the issue of orange, the toxic substance that was used during Vietnam. So what you're seeing now is bipartisan support, strong bipartisan support in passing this legislation to address these concerns. And one of the things that's really interesting is that you saw the president address Jon Stewart, the famous comedian and actor who had been the strongest proponent for this legislation. You heard the president say to him, "We owe you big," because he had pushed Congress to push this forward. He got a very extended standing ovation from those gathered there at the White House this morning. But Jon Stewart, the face of this, just as he was the face for the exposures of toxic exposures at the 9/11 Ground Zero location. So that's why this signing ceremony is taking place today. In large measure to Stewart's activism, he put a face as well as to all the other victims themselves who had suffered from these illnesses that you heard there. The president talking about Sergeant First Class Heath Robinson's family. He was a combat medic who in Iraq, he came back, suffered severe illnesses, and ultimately died from the illnesses that he suffered while exposed to the burn pit. And you heard the president there talk about as well his own son, Beau Biden, who, when he served with the Delaware National Guard in Iraq, ultimately died from brain cancer that the president believes was due to his exposure to burn pits.
Now, Jay, despite that strong bipartisan support that Louis referred to for this bill, it did fail in the Senate just a week before finally passing. What happened there, and what finally got this across the finish line?
Well, Diane, this was a bipartisan bill at its outset. It gets to the Senate, as you mentioned, it fails. Now, Senate Republicans said one of their reasoning for voting against it was because there was a budgetary provision in the bill that they did not like. They felt circumvented procedure. Democrats argued that the Republican opposition was actually because Republicans were angry about those one-time secret negotiations over the Inflation Reduction Act that involved Chuck Schumer and Joe Manchin. The bill gets back on track, though, after weekends of protests. Don't forget, as the president mentioned, there were combat veterans sitting on the steps of the United States Capitol. Jon Stewart was with them, protesting, trying to shame lawmakers into passing this legislation. It comes back after that weekend to the Senate. 11 Republicans end up voting against it, but it does pass with some bipartisan support. And you heard the president at the end of his remarks there discuss bipartisanship. His exact quote was, "We got it done together." And so obviously the White House trying to show that this is a bipartisan piece of legislation that can go on to help millions of veterans.
And Louis, these toxic burn pits, which is the sort of the more recent problem attributed to some of these health issues that veterans are dealing with, is really, as you explained, a way of sort of disposing of combat waste and so on. So is there an alternative now? Has that practice itself changed?
Yeah, that is something that the Pentagon has been exploring. They've realized that there are health consequences as a result of that. I mean, it's very obvious, right? You have a temporary military facility in a combat zone, and you don't expect that you're going to be there for an extended period of time. So when you're there temporarily, it's okay to create a burn pit to get rid of your waste. You're going to have a lot of waste because you're going to have thousands of troops in one general location. But over time, as those facilities end up becoming longer and longer term, as it was the case both in Iraq and Afghanistan, you started seeing larger exposures. So the question then becomes for the Pentagon, how do you deal with that short-term need, because you are going to need to get rid of that waste somehow, versus over the long term? Do you continue to use burn pits over time, knowing that over time there could be potential exposures that could be a health risk to your service members? So that's one of the things that the Pentagon is looking at. They know that there are environmental concerns. They know that there are health concerns. They're trying to figure out ways of how to address this in the future.
Now, Jay, this is one of a few areas where veterans have talked about, facing issues dealing with the VA. How will this law help them in the short term and the long term?
Well, as Louis mentioned earlier, one of the quickest provisions of this law is that veterans no longer have to prove that their illness, that their symptoms related to toxic exposure is directly tied to their service. The VA will now presume that going forward, and that's going to help open up some of the claims process here. But there is something in this bill that also scales up the VA, allows them to deal with this new massive amount of claims that they will receive. But veterans groups, as we've been saying, they are watching this warily, because although they are extremely happy about the passage of this legislation, about it being signed into law, the onus is now on the VA. It's up to the VA to carry out this law, to get these benefits to veterans in a timely fashion. And keep in mind, there are veterans, there are families of veterans, there are survivors of veterans who have passed away, family members who have been waiting on some kind of help as it relates to this for years, if not decades, so they don't want to wait any longer, and they're hoping the VA can expedite that. And the president mentioned this as well. His point in all of this is that if you are a veteran, if you've had some kind of toxic exposure, get to the VA quickly. Go to that website that the president mentioned, the VA's PACT Act website, and try to get in line somewhat quickly as the VA staffs up to try to meet this demand.
And Louis, to the extent these veterans need help, some of them reach a point where they actually need personal caregivers. So either the family has to hire someone to come in, of course extremely expensive, or their spouse, let's say, or another family member leaves their job to care for them permanently. What does this law do for those people?
Well, they will provide assistance. You heard that stipend that will be provided to family members who have lost their loved ones, but it'll also provide assistance, monetary assistance to those families, so that who have current needs in addressing the needs of their service members for whatever health reasons. I remember last year ABC did a profile of a service member who she was going through breast cancer, repeated episodes of breast cancer, it had gone away, come back, and she was not able to endure essentially the illness that she was suffering. And she did not live to see what is going on right now. And so it is very important for families to deal with the situation that they are dealing with at the current time. And I think that this bill will be able to address that in some way. But of course, as Jay's talking about, veterans groups are looking to see how quickly this will all be implemented. The truth will be in how quickly this all really gets into place.
Now, in terms of the severity of these conditions, how will these veterans learn to navigate this in the future, Louis? Could this pave the way for maybe, today it's burn pits, and you talked about Agent Orange in Vietnam. Could this set a precedent for future issues that maybe are tied to medical issues, it becoming easier for veterans to link that to their service?
Well, there's always the precedent. We did talk about Agent Orange in the 1960s. You talk in Vietnam. It took almost 20 to 30 years later for that issue to be addressed. Let's remember when the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq started in the early 2000s. And then now, 20 years later, we're seeing this now being addressed, the issue of burn pits and exposures and illnesses resulting from those exposures. If there is a future combat, the situation probably needs to be accelerated. But because we're seeing this bipartisanship moving forward on Capitol Hill to address exposures in combat zones. But of course, we have to wait and see if this is actually going, if this president itself is going to speed up that process for other health issues. Currently, right now, there are other issues not involving war zones that the military is trying to address. You're seeing environmental and health concerns over what are known as forever chemicals, known by the initials PFAS, PFAS. These are essentially firefighting foams that have seeped into the water tables at military facilities. There's a very efficient use of this foam for protective purposes. But now we're concerned that these chemicals may remain in individuals' bodies and cause health issues. What is going to be done about that? Will this legislation impact that as well?
All right, Louis Martinez, Jay O'Brien, thank you both.
Hi, everyone. George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live event coverage, click on the right over here to subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to download the ABC News app for breaking news alerts. Thanks for watching.